The cold bit deep, even through the thick gloves and flight gear. The year was 1991, and while the Cold War had begun to thaw diplomatically, the Arctic air above the Norwegian Sea didn't care much for politics. Out here, beneath low-hanging cloud cover and between roiling gray waves, tensions still simmered just below the surface, and so did the jets flying patrol. One of them, cutting across the frozen sky like a steel predator, bore the unmistakable silhouette of the F-14 Tomcat. It was a beast built for speed, aggression, and survival. Twin tails, variable sweep wings, and a radar system that, in its time, was light years ahead of the curve. The Grumman F-14 Tomcat wasn't just a fight, was a symbol, a message, and in January of 1991, that message was being broadcast loud and clear from the deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt, CVN-71. The Roosevelt was deployed to the Norwegian Sea under Operation North Star, a joint NATO training and surveillance initiative meant to remind adversaries that the high north was still contested. With the Soviet Union dissolving before the world's eyes, there was a strange mix of confidence and caution in the air. Nobody knew exactly what would happen next. But the Navy wasn't going to wait around to find out. That morning, Lieutenant Commander Jake Iceman Grady and his RIO, Lieutenant John Wizard Barnes, were the first to be launched into the gray. Their F-14B was running hot, engines warmed, and checklists confirmed. The deck crew, bundled up in what looked like Arctic survival suits, moved like clockwork. The catapult fired with a thunderous roar, launching the Tomcat into a wall of wind and sleet. It was time to begin the patrol. In the air, the F-14 was poetry in motion. The flight plan took Grady and Barnes along a wide arc, paralleling the coast of Norway before dipping toward the Bear Island Gap, a narrow passage of sea that had become infamous during the Cold War as a choke point for Soviet subs and surface groups. Even in 1991, old habits died hard. The radar lit up. Something was out there. Wizard, I've got a hit 40 miles out, no transponder. Copy that. Single contact. Altitude 28,000. Vectoring in. The contact wasn't behaving like a commercial aircraft. No course change, no radio ID, and the profile on the radar didn't quite match NATO aircraft. Grady eased the stick forward, pushing the Tomcat into a climb. The engines wind as the variable geometry wings adjusted to give him better performance at higher speed. They were burning through the clouds, now, racing toward the unknown. Then they saw it. It was a Tu-95 Bear, the Soviet long-range maritime bomber. Massive, unmistakable, and loud, those for turboprop engines, spinning like saw blades in the sky. The Bear was flying a high-speed run, hugging the boundary of NATO airspace without ever quite crossing it. It was an old game. One side pokes, the other side chases. But 1991 made it different. Because back in Moscow, the power structure was cracking. The Soviet military was still active, still dangerous, but the orders they followed were coming from a system rapidly falling apart. That made things unpredictable. Grady pulled alongside the Bear at a safe distance, maintaining visual contact. Inside the Soviet aircraft, a crewman peered back at the Tomcat, camera in hand, snapping a few shots for their own archives. It was almost comical, two Cold War warriors waving at each other through cockpit glass, each representing governments that might not exist in the same form in a few months' time, but that levity disappeared in an instant. Jake, we've got a second hit? Small, fast, coming in low, 15 miles and closing. Roger that, let's light him up. The F-14 banked hard, descending through a blanket of storm clouds. Rain and sleet streaked across the canopy. Visibility dropped, but the radar didn't lie. A second aircraft was inbound, and it was hauling. Could be a flanker, could be worse. The Arctic sky exploded with turbulence as they punched through the storm wall and sighted the target. A flash of light, then wings, then confirmation. It was a MiG-29 Fulcrum, and it was armed. Grady didn't hesitate. He banked right, dropping altitude, and throwing the F-14 into a defensive maneuver. The MiG followed. It wasn't a direct engagement, not yet. This was all still within the gray area of rules of engagement, but the dance had begun, and every movement mattered. Grady's heart pounded. The Tomcat's wings swept forward to give them more lift in the thinner air near sea level. The Fulcrum closed fast, trying to get a lock. But Grady knew the Tomcat better than most knew their own cars. He pushed it into a high-speed climb, then dropped the throttle just long enough to break visual contact in the clouds above. The MiG followed, but it was too fast, too committed. By the time the Soviet pilot corrected, Grady had looped back and was now behind him. Wizard was calm. We've got tone. Grady didn't fire. He didn't need to. McMilot knew exactly what had happened. He leveled off, gave a slow banking turn, and headed back toward neutral airspace. The Bear had already turned north. Grady and Barnes kept on course for another 20 minutes. Scanning, watching, waiting, but the skies had quieted. No more radar hits, no more close calls. Back aboard the Roosevelt, the rest of the air wing had launched 4 standard patrols, each logging their own miles over frozen waters. Norwegian frigates and British destroyers maintained a loose picket line across the sea, their sonar arrays slicing through the depths, in search of submarines that might still be prowling beneath the waves. It wasn't just about showing force, it was about maintaining presence, reassurance, because while the Cold War might have been ending, the need for vigilance was still very real. In fact, some argued it was even more important now. With empires crumbling, uncertainty became the new enemy. Over the next 48 hours, the Roosevelt's air wing conducted multiple sorties. F-14s patrolled alongside Norwegian F-16s. Surveillance aircraft from the RAF flew overlapping tracks, snapping high-res photos of the Russian Kola Peninsula. And deep beneath the sea, American fast attack subs played cat-and-mouse with their Soviet counterparts, the echoes of Cold War doctrine still fresh. On day 3 of the patrol, the weather worsened, a polar vortex dipped lower than expected, and the Roosevelt was rocked by 50-knot winds and horizontal snow. Deck operations became dangerous. Launches were delayed, refueling flights had to be canceled, but the F-14s still flew. That morning, Grady and Barnes were airborne again. Their jet was coated in ice crystals from the sudden freezing fog, and for several minutes they flew blind, relying entirely on instruments. That's when they saw something impossible. "Jake, we've got a sonar buoy ping. We're 60 miles north of any scheduled ASW patrol. Could be a ghost buoy, or it could be a Russian sub drifting too close." That changed everything. They called it in. Within 30 minutes, a pair of S-3 Vikings were scrambled to the area, along with a P-3 Orion from a Norwegian base at Antøya. The readings were faint, but consistent. A contact at 400 feet. Moving slowly, west at, it was a Delta-class Soviet sub. They didn't engage. They didn't need to. But the message was clear. While the surface world was shifting, the underwater chessboard was still in play. That patrol, in the frigid shadow of the Arctic Circle, would end up being one of the last major coordinated NATO shows of force against a unified Soviet military. Within months, the USSR would cease to exist. New republics would rise. Former enemies would begin slow, uneasy collaborations. But in the cockpit of the Tomcat, all of that felt distant. All that mattered was the mission, the radar, the contact, the flight, the brotherhood. And when the Roosevelt finally turned south, heading back toward warmer seas, the pilots knew they had witnessed the end of an era. Not with a bang, but with the sound of jet engines echoing across ice. The F-14 Tomcat, long before retirement, had done what it was designed to do: defend, deter, and dominate, even in the coldest corners of the world, even when history was changing all around it. And long after that patrol faded into the history books, the roar of that twin-engine beast over the Norwegian Sea would remain etched in the memory of everyone who flew it, because once you go below zero, you never forget the cold.